Hi, everyone. My name is Ian Andrews. I am Chief Marketing Officer at Chainalysis, and I'm joined by Janet Ho, our Head of Policy for Europe at Chainalysis. Janet, excited to have this conversation with you this morning.
Happy to be here.
Now, last week, you hosted a webinar all about the new MiCA regulation in Europe, and it was incredibly popular. I think we had a few thousand people register, well over 1,000 attended live. Tell us a little bit about why you think this was such a popular topic for us.
Yeah, it was a surprise to me as well, because it's after all about policy and regulation. People think that would be boring things. Like, why would I want to listen to policy for over an hour on this issue? But I think it really do tell us two interesting observations. Is that because this is MiCA, Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation, is the first piece of crypto regulation in Europe. And a lot of the businesses are new to regulation in this sector. They haven't really understand about what regulation means. Unlike banks or other like securities firms, trading firms, they have been under regulation for a long time. So having a piece of regulation coming out, it tells you that people are interested in regulation, want to be compliant. But this is like, it's all positive sign. That's one point. But I think the second point is because they are new, the industry is new, the regulation is new, the way that they will be supervised will also be new. So there's definitely a strong interest there in understanding more about how this piece of regulation will work and how will that impact them.
There's quite a lot to the regulation. We got a large number of questions actually came in on the webinar. And so what we're going to try and do today is kind of unpack some of those topics in a little bit more detail. And we'll share this out as a companion piece to the original webinar artifact. So anybody who missed you live, they'll get to watch not only that recording, but our chat here today, where we dive into some couple topics a little bit more deeply. Now, one part that was particularly interesting was we were actually able to run some questions from the audience. Now, maybe not a scientific poll, but we did have a few thousand respondents. And so I think it's interesting maybe to start with the poll questions and talk a little bit about the results and reaction that we got there, because I think this is a good barometer on people's feelings about the new regulation and how that's developed over time. So question one was pretty simple. It was actually, are you happy with MiCA? How did people react?
Yeah, I was actually quite surprised to see some of the results because during the MiCA negotiation for over 2.5 years, that you heard a lot of negative sentiments about it. People were unsure about whether this will be the next crypto GDPR movement in the EU, and they will be affected. But turns out by the time that when MiCA adopted and published and confirmed last month, and MiCA actually will be coming into force on the 29th of June this year. Those of our audience actually, over half of them, like over 55% of them, are actually quite happy about MiCA. So it's half, like at least they're not unhappy. But if you also look at the figures of people actually not happy about it, is only 5%. So overall, it's like 55% happy about MiCA and 5%. So what about the rest of the audience? That is actually also tell you something about it. All the remaining audience, they're saying that they're still making up their mind. I think it's a fair point because even with MiCA, we have like the final version is over 200 pages of legislation, but there are actually a lot of details yet to be defined. So at the moment, the two important regulators at the European level, the European Banking Authority, and the European Securities and Market Authority, they are actually still crafting some of the detailed operational rules about MiCA. So say, for example, in MiCA, you're the stablecoin issuer, then how would you be affected by these rules in terms of your transactions, in terms of your activities? So those are a lot of like operational details that have yet to be laid down on a point in the level 1 text, that the 200 pages that we've seen here. So, and that's one point. And if you are a crypto asset service provider, how do you actually submit your MiCA license application, information, the format, the form, and all that? Those are also information that have yet to be laid down in the sort of like adopted text. So I think, given that there's still a lot of moving parts, there's still consultation of these, what we call level 2 and level 3 measures, then I think it will be that certainly explain why still sort of like half of the 40% of the audience are still not too sure about MiCA at this stage.
Well, I mean, that's fair to reserve judgment until you've actually seen what the application form looks like. I think I would fall in that camp personally if I was operating a crypto business. Now, question 2, do you agree that MiCA will scale up crypto activities in the EU? Which is a really interesting question, because I think in many jurisdictions around the world, we're seeing regulation put in place that I think is really intended to prevent crypto activity, limit retail investor exposure, restrict, the number of businesses operating and the activities they can engage in. But talk about the results that we saw here and how that might reflect a different sentiment coming out of the EU.
Yeah, on this one, I think if the European regulators seeing the responses, they will be very happy about it. About 62.5% of our audience think that the activities will be scaled up. About 18.2% of them remained a neutral stance, and only about 19% of them do not think that the activities will scale up. And I think this is very important because as our audience also will be very familiar with it, a lot of the crypto activities right now happened in the US, not really in Europe. And it's very promising statistics here that we've seen that a lot of our audience thinks that MiCA will actually drive the sort of like developments, crypto businesses, and the operation actually headquartering in the EU. Then it's also a possible business move for them to diversify their business risk and operational risk from operating in other jurisdiction that don't have regulation yet. And then in Europe, now that they have the MiCA, have the regulatory clarity there, would actually give them positive signals to do business in the EU. So I think this is a positive signal that we've seen.
Well, and I would imagine that this maybe sets the model globally for what does reasonable regulation look like, right? We've heard a lot of people for years now saying, well, we want regulatory clarity, but it's actually a little bit more than that, I think, from industry. They want not only clarity on the regulations, but they want a pathway to legal and legitimate operations.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And so it seems like maybe we've gotten here based on the results of that question with MiCA. But then our third question, what is the biggest obstacle to a smooth MiCA implementation? How did our audience respond?
Yeah, we have 4 options for this question. The first one, not understanding the MiCA requirements, that gives us about 34.5%. Answer option 2 is too many requirements, 30%. So these two are actually the higher responses rate that we've seen, quite similar, but biggest obstacle. I think this is actually go back to our discussion just now on the first question. Crypto industry is new. The services are new, and also the regulations are new. So a lot of the market participants, especially small and medium-sized players, they actually have no idea about regulation. And to them, these 200 plus page of MiCA rules will be very complicated for them to sort of like to decipher on, to understand, and to comply. But we also have like 2 other answered options. A third one is limited guidance from national competent authorities. We have about 19.9%. Grouping together, thinking together on answered option 4 is inconsistent approaches by national competent authorities. That's also have like 15.7%. So you see that these audience choosing these options are likely will want to have more support and more guidance from their national supervisors in the EU member state to guide them through the authorization and supervisory process. But they don't think that this is like the biggest obstacle. It's still really going back to the sort of like MiCA requirements, the actual implementation, and that is the biggest obstacle that our audience see today.
When you think about member states in the EU and the at the country level regulatory
Mhm.
authorities, do you feel like they're prepared today to support businesses who are trying to go through the application and then ultimately, regulate those businesses when it comes to the digital assets sector, or is there work to be done on the on preparing them as well?
It's certainly a mix. So some countries, some member states, they are already very active,
Yeah.
already transposing some of the MiCA rules in the national system, even before MiCA formally applies. So you see that there's certain one group of member states in the EU, they are prepared and they are doing a lot of promotion saying that we want to be the next crypto hub. And they also actively have like conversation with the existing market participants to help them to transition to the MiCA process. So that is a very sophisticated and advanced set. But we also have another set that is like, they're friendly. They haven't transposed all the rules or most of the rules or even any rules of MiCA rules in the national regime. But they are also saying that come to talk to us. We will actually from now, between now to MiCA full implementation, walk you through all the compliance requirements so that by the time that MiCA kicks in, we can give you the license. They do like a sort of like pre-consultation, a pre-MiCA consultation approach. So that's also interesting. They're definitely ready. But certainly, we do see there is also quite a big group of supervisors. Right now, they're still doing this like wait and see approach. They are not going to do anything, or at least the sort of like publicly or even with their existing registered market participants to get them prepared for MiCA. So it's really a mix. And I think these different attitudes will also impact on how the crypto businesses will choose which member state that they want to headquarter in the EU when MiCA fully kicks in.
That was my suspicion as well. So depends very much on the jurisdiction that you're in, the kind of experience you're likely to have over the coming months as you prepare for MiCA. Now, during the webinar, not only did we have massive attendance, but we got a large number of questions where people wanted to dive deeper, and we've grouped them into 5 topics. So let's jump into these. The first one really relates to MiCA and then interaction with other regulations in the EU or global regulations that exist out there. Things like sanctions, the travel rule, or anti-money laundering regulations. Like, how did these things fit together, Janet?
Yeah, so a lot of audience are still trying to understand all these acronyms, new rules, new regulations. But come to understand that MiCA is really not about AML/CFT in a sense that it's not really about counter illicit finance. It focuses on, if we think about the illicit activities, MiCA focuses on the prevention of market abuse. So they have a whole chapter about it. It's not really entirely about money laundering, but there are certainly elements to it because in order to get MiCA license, then the businesses also need to comply with certain AML/CFT requirements. The AML/CFT supervisor in the EU member state, they also have a say to give an opinion to the financial supervisor who's actually dishing out the approval to say whether this entity should or should not have this MiCA license. So there is AML/CFT element in it, but not too much. And coming to think about it, if you really have to think about what is really about MiCA, if it is not sanctions, just yesterday, the EU agreed on an 11th sanction package against Russia. So it's not really about sanction. It's not really about AML/CFT, but it's really about how to conduct business, how to get a license, the governance arrangements, the general obligations of doing businesses. It's the sort of like market conduct activities piece. But if you allow me to go deeper on AML/CFT, because we do have a lot of questions about how we actually treat AML/CFT and travel rule together with MiCA here, that I think it's very important for businesses to actually go back to the European Commission webpage on digital finance. They do set out 4 different pieces of just AML regulation in this space. So the first one is travel rule, the transfer of funds regulation, that will also implement at the same time as MiCA. So there's like 2 parallel track of piece of legislation adopted at that day, on that day. So the first piece of AML regulation is the travel rule, transfer of funds regulation. There's a second piece of AML regulation, another one on the 6th AML directive being discussed, and also an AML authority regulation. So these 3 pieces, 3 AML pieces legislation, they are still being discussed and negotiated right now in the EU, in Brussels, in the European level, and hopefully by the end of this year or maybe early next year, we'll have more clarity on this package. So watch out for those implementation timeframe, because if those timeframes have a more ambitious timetable, closely aligned with the MiCA implementation day, meaning those businesses who want to apply for the MiCA license, they also need to be aware of those obligations in those 4 separate pieces of AML regulation.
Yeah, this is a great point. MiCA simplifies and clarifies a number of things about operating across the EU region, but it doesn't let anybody off the hook for tackling things that maybe come from the FATF or other organizations that that impact, regulated financial services businesses. A second big question we got is, okay, this is great. It simplified how we can do business within the EU, but there's a lot of adjacent countries with high degrees of interaction. And like Switzerland, as an example, we know they have their crypto valley where a number of companies have domiciled, and obviously the UK, Andorra, many crypto organizations in the US or the UAE. Like how do companies operating in those jurisdictions then have the opportunity to operate in the EU, or the reverse? Like what does MiCA say there?
Yeah, so there are another two dimensions of looking at it. The first one is, but I will come to that and say it's not that easy to just like classify things by 2. But first, go back to the simple things. So if you're a 3rd country firm, you, meaning any of the countries that you name and many, many other more outside the EU, if you want to serve EU customers, you still will be caught by MiCA if one of your services are caught by the 10 types of crypto asset services as defined in MiCA. Say, for example, if you're a 3rd country firm, want to offer custody services to EU customers in the EU, then you will be captured by MiCA. So meaning you still need to apply for the MiCA licenses. But there's a catch there. If you're a 3rd country firm, you don't solicit services, you don't advertise services to EU residents or in the EU, but people in the EU come to you on its own initiative, then that 3rd country firm don't need to apply for MiCA license. But I think that is always very difficult to prove, and it's also will be difficult. It's certainly one of the issues that the European Commission is already thinking about it, and whether MiCA 2.0 need to do something about that. But at least for now, if you're a 3rd country firm, you don't actively solicit services in the EU, then you are sort of like out of MiCA. So for businesses in these countries currently doing businesses, but if you want to do business with the EU, you will need to still follow EU. That's one point. The second point is, if you are these 3rd country firms, that you actually don't want to get licensed in the EU, think that because there's so many rules and so many obligations and new requirements that impact your business model, you may as well want to stay in those countries. But don't be like feel comfortable because a lot of these countries are already looking at the MiCA provision. They are actually monitoring closely on whether there are merits to actually borrow some of these elements into their own national regime. Certainly, stable coins rules in MiCA are other very robust rules that a lot of other countries are looking into it. Some may want to go for a more relaxed approach. Other maybe will adopt similar approaches to it. So give just a flavor, that example is to tell businesses that operating outside the EU that you shouldn't really be complacent, because that is something that will likely or could come in towards you if the if the member state if of your headquarter country right now, of your home country right now, want to leverage and actually want to do that rule. But I think another point that I also want to put here is that get people into thinking here is that even if you are not getting a MiCA license, but if everyone can see the MiCA rules, go take a look at it as if you can model some of your way to do business, your risk management program, your governance program on some of these MiCA rules. I think it's actually give businesses a good story to tell to whoever supervisors that they are going to deal with, that you actually have a good point to demonstrate that you are ready to do business in a responsible manner. And so I think that is sort of like MiCA laid down that benchmark baseline rules for businesses to think about when they want to reformulate their approach in communicating with regulators.
In effect, it's a set of generally good best practices that businesses operating in the crypto assets ecosystem should think about adopting, even if you're not in the EU or planning to do business in the EU. Now, one of the other topics that we got a lot of questions on relates to MiCA and the banking sector, and I think this is an area where crypto businesses have been particularly challenged over the last year. I know where I live in the U.S., this has been a topic in the news frequently. How, if at all, does MiCA improve access to the banking sector for a crypto business?
Yeah, certainly crypto businesses are excited about having some kind of rules, MiCA rules. If they follow the rules, they also got the MiCA approval license from the supervisors. It actually gives them an explanation to demonstrate to banks that we are compliant. Then we will be able to get banking service, get access to banking services from them, because currently it's also very difficult for businesses in Europe to actually access banking services. But with the regulatory clarity that brought by MiCA, everyone knows that how should be a compliant businesses look like, and that they should have those elements in it. So it certainly will have like an improvement, but how much and to what extent, that it will be something that we need to watch out for, because if we look at the issue of de-risking and the banking issue, it happens to a lot of the non-financial sector, not just crypto as well. A lot of, even today at FATF, they're still talking about how NGOs are so difficult to get banking services sometimes, how to get a bank account. So this could also be have some relevance to think about like crypto ecosystem. But I do want to add on one point is, yes, this is the crypto businesses interaction with the traditional financial institutions. But come MiCA, we actually also see that traditional financial institutions has been increasingly interested in investing in actually in crypto. So just this past, actually in the past 6 months since the adoption and political negotiation with MiCA, we see that a lot of traditional financial institutions, big and key players, they have been seeking existing license in EU member state. So if you have been following the headlines just this week in Germany, Deutsche Bank applied for a digital asset license with BaFin, the German supervisor. That's encouraging news, that you see that for custody service, you see that traditional financial institutions are also thinking to get involved to do businesses.
Yeah, that's a really interesting shift. I was thinking about this topic really from the perspective of a crypto native business, but maybe one effect here is that we see traditional finance being much more comfortable moving into the sector with the new framework, which is exciting.
Because in MiCA, they actually have like a simplified procedures or simplified rules for existing licensees. Say, for example, if they are existing licensed credit institution to do business, in some of the cases, they only need to notify their supervisor that they will also do businesses in these other views on crypto asset services specified in MiCA. They don't need to go through necessarily the long MiCA authorization process. So even if you are a bank, you want to provide certain crypto asset services, you will have like a easier track in order to do business. But regardless, we still see banks actually actively applying for a crypto license, business license. So I think this is a positive signal that we've seen in the sort of increasing involvement in the traditional financial institutions and interconnection between the two systems.
That's terrific. Now, one big thing that got left out of MiCA, and I'm hearing the term MiCA 2.0 already being tossed around. So we know that there's going to be forthcoming updates, but the current regs really intentionally stayed away from decentralized finance. Why was that decision made, and like what should people who are involved with DeFi or interested in using DeFi, how should they think about the current status under MiCA?
Yeah, this is one of the most heated debate. And even when now actually MiCA as its current form excludes DeFi, there's still a lot of discussion going on. Actually, are they excluded? So at the moment, under MiCA, what the law says is services that are performed in a fully decentralized manner without any intermediary are outside the scope of MiCA. So a lot of question marks out there. We definitely need to see how whether there were any clarification in level 2 tax, and whether actually national competent authorities like individual EU member state supervisor will give more guidance and give more explanation on that. Because I'm sure that everyone of our audience will know there's always this definition, the debate on DeFi definition. What is a DeFi? What is a true DeFi? So it will be very interesting to actually follow the regulatory messages and statements issued by regulators within the EU on what and how they interpret DeFi. So that is one piece going on in MiCA right now. But in the current text of MiCA level 1, adopted one, they already specify 3 different dates for future review. So the first day is by the end of, by 30th December 2024, European Commission already need to issue a first report on the assessment of the DeFi development in the EU, to give an assessment on whether it is necessary and whether it is feasible to regulate DeFi. So by the end of 2024, first day, first review, but they also add 2 more days in 2025, June 30th, and as well as 2027, June 30th. These 2 days is that the European Commission will still have to submit a report on those 2 days to explain whether there will be new legislative proposal on DeFi. So you see that while the Commission has sort of like let DeFi go in this current form of MiCA, but you see that like basically every 2 years, there will be a review on the sort of materiality and the development and the scope and the scale of activities of DeFi to see if and when and how to scope that DeFi piece in.
All right, so we'll have to stay tuned to learn more about where things go with DeFi. The last big topic where we got a lot of questions was, okay, great, the legislation's passed, June 29th, it goes into force. I'm really excited. I feel positive about the framework. How do I actually go and operate as a business? And, these questions varied from things like, well, I'm already registered and licensed as a virtual asset service provider in my jurisdiction. How does MiCA impact me? Or, how do national rules within my EU member country layer on to things that MiCA has proposed? Because I think there's a, incrementality there question. And then even simple things like, how do I get my license? And now I want to operate beyond my country of jurisdiction into other member countries. So this passporting concept sounds great, but like, when does that really come into play? So can you walk us through some of these operational questions, or when you expect us to have a little bit more detail on these topics?
Yeah, these are certainly real questions that we've been hearing every day since MiCA adoption. But first, businesses need to sort out whether they are currently registered or they are licensed, because that puts you into different regime. Explain a little bit what is the difference between a registration and a license. A registration basically has a more relaxed approach. Sometimes you only need to give a basic company information to the country, then you saying that you're offering crypto exchange businesses, then you're good to go. No one will really come go to your office, want to see the books and want to actually know what you're doing. So registration. For this group of businesses, you really need to do a lot more, because you are not under an authorization regime which is subject to supervision, more frequent checks. So if you are currently registered in a country, meaning you still actually need to submit application, MiCA license application when MiCA comes into full force in 2024. So December 30th. So this is the group that you need to do, basically a fresh start for you, so to speak. But if you're currently authorized, not many EU member states actually have an authorization regime, but there are some, and there are a few market participants, big ones, also that are authorized. Then what you need to do is that maybe you can relax a little bit, because in MiCA, they actually give you a longer time frame, that so long as you got an existing license in an EU member state by 30th of December 2024, you can actually do businesses until the 1st of July 2026. So they are not like kicking you out immediately or putting you to the full MiCA treatment immediately. But the thing is, if you do submit application, MiCA application, the sort of license application during this period, you may be subject to a more simplified procedure. You may likely be able to get an easier approval because MiCA also specified that existing authorized market participants will be able to enjoy simplified procedures. But of course, the simplified procedures, what are they? How simplified they are and how widely they will be practiced and adopted is still the question mark. So, but then the thing is, you do really need to sort of like submit the application during the sort of the first 2 years of MiCA implementation, or probably now that you want to actually encourage your home member supervisor to think about whether the simplified procedure would apply to you and encourage that discussion. Because if you can benefit from all those requirements, meaning that you will be one of the first businesses can do businesses in the entire EU in 27 member states. Because if you think about going back to think about the MiCA licensing timeframe, if only countries are receiving the application, say, for example, on 2nd January 2025, who works over the new year, right? So if that time people only been receiving the application, and even in a good case scenario, as MiCA apply, the rules specify that it still needs 4 to 5 months if there's no follow-up question to get that MiCA license approved. Then for existing market players, if you're authorized businesses there, you really want to make sure that you can have the continuity of your services, not just in the country that you are currently operating in, but also in the rest of the other 26 member states that you also want to have business in. Then it means that you probably want to, if you are operating in the EU right now and may actually want to think about whether you should already be seeking a license now, then you will be able to benefit from the MiCA simplified licensing procedure.
So it sounds like there's definitely some incentives to starting early, engaging on the process now versus waiting till the very last minute, as it always is in life, it seems. Well, Janet, this was fantastic. I feel like I learned a ton. Hopefully our audience out there also feels like they've gotten some additional questions answered, but I'm certain this won't be the last time that we have you on to talk about MiCA. So thank you very much for all the time and the great content today.
Thank you for having me.